You're here for the topic, democratic socialism and law. And so that is what we're going to talk about, starting with this idea here from Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman argued that a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic in the sense of guaranteeing individual freedom. He said there was no example of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom that does not also use something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. And that was his book, which came from a series of lectures in the 1950s and 60s called Capitalism and Freedom in 1962. And the main argument that I'm going to make starts with the fact that this is wrong in its entirety. So first of all, today, whatever the case was in 1962, the fact is that wealthy democratic governments spend, produce, or in Friedman's words, organize about half or more of gross domestic product. So this is a chart from OECD countries, and you can see, so as a percentage of GDP, most countries have spending by the government which is close to or above 50%. So, you know, already there, Friedman is wrong that the free market is organizing the bulk of economic activity. Moreover, if we look at where people work, in the UK, just to take one example, but we could have lots, 54% of the population is employed by the public sector, or they get a public pension, or receive an income from the public sector, or they are being educated in public schools, in the public education system. So even on that basis alone, what Friedman says is no longer accurate. We can look at it in different ways. We don't have to look at government share of GDP, but this chart from Thomas Piketty, of course, the French economics professor over at Paris School of Economics, shows over time from 1870 up until 2020, we see the gradual rise in what the public sector organizes in the economy, up to 47%, but he's not including publicly owned industries as well. So we get to, you know, pretty close to government performing most of the economic functions in a normal democracy today. But even outside the public sector, it's not true to say, as Milton Friedman claimed, that economic activity is organized mostly by the free market, because today most markets are built with social rights and social security, far away from Friedman's idea of sort of laissez-faire free market economics. Most markets are built with rights for consumers, rights for employees, rights for tenants, and rights for investors. So the main points that I want to get across are these. Not only that Friedman is wrong, and that democracy and socialism are in fact compatible, that democracy and socialism, democratic socialism, are the engines, the chief engines of human progress in today's world. They have been for some time. And the ignition of that change is the law. So what I'm basically going to do throughout the course of the next hour or so is I'm going to set out the problems, I'm going to try and give you some solutions, and then I'm going to explode a few myths about capitalism. So number one, the problems of capitalism start with this idea of private ownership in the means of production, freedom of contract, or corporations and free competition. The problem is that these institutions, which people think of as capitalism, fail to achieve social justice. Democratic socialism is a movement. It is shared by many parties. It goes under many names. But most political systems have transformed these institutions to become something more democratic and social. Next point is that democratic socialism, what it does is it retunes the distortions created by these legal institutions. The distortions of these old legal forms, property, contract, and corporations. And they do that, first of all, by putting public services into public hands. Second of all, by creating economic democracy with the floor of social rights. And thirdly, through fair taxes. And this leads to vastly superior socio-economic outcomes than if we just had the Friedmanite version of the economy. Property, contract, and the 19th century of corporate competition. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some of the myths that are very common. Number one, that capitalism creates more innovation. Two, that it's more productive. Three, that it's less wasteful. Or four, that it supports democracy. And very simply, those claims are not backed up by the facts. Okay, so let's start with the problems. Because the theories of democratic socialism that we have today have really been shaped by the theories of where capitalism failed. So first of all, we need to talk about, or to sort of get up to speed on what the standard account is, or the standard critiques of capitalism that have been used to build democratic socialist theory. Secondly, we're going to say something about humanity's basic goals, and for democratic socialists, this is social justice. And thirdly, what democratic socialism means, and actually why definitions aren't too important. Okay, so first of all, theories of capitalism's failure. We have to start by looking at what people mean by capital. Adam Smith defined capital very usefully as property that makes revenue, or property for production, and he saw this as something distinct from property for consumption. The term capitalist and the term capitalism became different things. A capitalist was somebody who privately owned capital, so not the government owning capital. So you can still have publicly owned capital, but the term capitalist refers to private ownership of productive property. And capitalism is this too, private ownership of the means of production, but then these sort of two extra institutions. And in the 19th century form, this is what we still think of as capitalism today: freedom of contract, very simplistic idea of freedom of contract, and corporations that are meant to operate in a system of free competition. And the problem with all of these things that define, or at the core of what people think of as capitalism, is that these notions conceal reality, and they aren't really what they say on the tin. So let's start with private property. Property was said in its sort of 19th century theorization to be a relationship between a person and a thing. And this property relation is said to bind the whole world, and that's what distinguishes property from obligations. Obligations are rights between people. Property is a relation between a person and a thing that binds the whole world. The difficulty with this, and what it conceals, is that really all rights are relations between different people. And it can be in a relation to a thing, or it can be through a contract or a tort, but all rights are really relations between people. This is what Hofeld told us in his famous article on some basic conceptions in law in 1913. And because all relations, including property relations, ultimately end up being relations between people. You know, I can exclude you from this glass of water if it's my property. That creates inequality, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau explained in 1755. But more than that, the concept of property, the word property, conceals two different types of thing which you can have property in relation to. First of all, and this is what goes back to what Smith said, property can be over things for consumption, and this includes basic human rights, basic needs, food, water, housing, clothing. Very, very different to property for production, over factories, machinery, company shares, and so on. And this distinction is so important because if you have property over production, property over the means of production, then that creates more power over people, because people are employed or work together cooperatively to produce different things. Okay, so when we say private property in the means of production, actually, it's not really so private anymore, because all production, or most production, unless you're an individual trader, most production is cooperative. Most production is social. Private property over the means of production really means that some people in charge of production have control and can take profit, while others do not. Now, property has been it's been almost entirely transformed to what we would have seen in the early 19th century. You can't have property over human beings anymore. This was the idea that a person could become depersonified by becoming a slave. The slave could not own property. They could not make personal obligations, contracts, unless it was for the master. So, you know, property has been constrained in the number of things that we can have property over, but you can still rent out somebody's labor. So you can't own somebody who works for you, but you can rent their labor through the institution of contract. Property is also no longer the passport to the vote in politics. So it used to be the case that if you had property, if you had land, this would be why you got the vote in Parliament. The Great Reform Act of 1832 kept it, all the Reform Acts right up until 1918, when you had universal male suffrage, in 1928, when women finally got the vote on an equal basis to men. Property was the passport to participation in politics and in the government of politics. But still today, to get the vote in the economy, to have a vote in companies, property is still often necessary through having to have shares. So you need to buy shares usually to get a vote in a company. And this is why people like Franz Neumann would say that contract and property are key auxiliary institutions to the basic capitalist institution of property and particularly private ownership. Okay, so then we go on to contract and what the problems are with contract. In the 19th century conception, it was said, for instance, by Sir George Jessel, Master of the Rolls, that it was a paramount public policy that you don't lightly interfere with freedom of contract in a patent case called Printing and Numerical Company and Sampson. The difficulty with freedom of contract, this 19th century concept, is that, like property, it conflates two mutually opposing things. You can have a contract between parties who are equal and have equal bargaining power, and you can have contracts between parties who are unequal. Businesses on the one hand, with relatively equal bargaining power, employers and workers on the other hand, or landlords and tenants, or businesses that are selling the necessaries of life, food and water, and consumers that need them. And because of the inequality in the distribution of property, it means that there is higher disparities of bargaining power between unequal parties. So if you look at the case of employers, we go back to Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He explains why employers can always hold out longer in any negotiation because they have more property, and the worker who needs work, who needs income, is likely to go hungry before the employer who has many stocks to rely on. And so the employer can always get what they want in a negotiation or a dispute over wages. This inequality of bargaining power is raised by differences in organization. So if you've got a corporation bargaining with an individual, then the corporation has more bargaining power. If you've got more information than I do, that gives you more bargaining power as well. As if you've got an AI system, if you've got a big database, then your power in negotiation is greater. So inequality of bargaining power, beginning with the institution of property, means that freedom of contract is really not so free. Freedom of contract is a fearsome weapon in the hands of the strong, a blunted tool in the clutch of the weak. And what this means when we start to look at how it plays out, how this inequality bargaining plays out through legal institutions like contract, well, at work, we see two main implied terms that feature in every employment contract. Because of unequal bargaining power, the employer will usually have the right to appropriate the benefits of labor in a contract. So we see this in many cases, but one called Stevenson, Jordan, and MacDonald and Evans in 1952 makes the point that it's an implied term in the contract that the employer takes the lectures that somebody has written while they're at work. They have copyright over them. And if you think about this at work, every twist of a spanner, if you're a mechanic, every stroke of a key, if you're typing in an office, that creates a benefit from your work, will accrue to the property of the employer. This is the implied term in the employment contract, that the benefits of labor become the property of the employer. And it's actually the same thing in many fields of life. So if you think about how big tech uses your data, well, anytime you post something in X, you send a message in Gmail or WhatsApp, the data is being used according to the standard terms and conditions of the contract for the benefit of big tech. They can appropriate your data. OpenAI has just created a new business model by appropriating the data from everything on the internet. And then it uses that in order to sell you the premium version of ChatGPT. Okay, so we've got this right to appropriate as one standard term in a contract. Then there's also the right to direct. So the next standard term that is really crucial is that the employer will have the right to direct the worker's labor. The worker cannot direct what the employer does, but the employer can say, work differently, work faster, so long as it's within the scope of the contract and within your working hours. And with these two implied terms, it means that employers can take the gains of productive growth in the enterprise, and at an economic level, over the whole economy, it means that employers can take the gains of all economic growth across the economy. And that is one of the key reasons why labor share of income falls and capital share of income rises. It's not true that workers get, as some economists will claim, the marginal product of their labor. It's not true that wages are determined by supply and demand. Yes, that sets an outer boundary, but bargaining power and inequality of bargaining power is one of the key determinants of wages. Okay, so this is very problematic for defenders of capitalism, because we can see that the evidence is very, very clear that labor's share of income has been falling, and Exhibit A is in the United States, where pretty much since 1980, American workers have seen zero wage growth, and for the poorest Americans, the lowest decile, wages have fallen precipitously. The minimum wage now is much, much lower than it was even in 1970. This chart shows output per hour, so that's productivity. American workers are more productive than they ever have been before, partly because they're working harder, but mainly because of capital accumulation. But pay has almost entirely stagnated. Surely we're better off in Britain. Well, not that much, because the time for us in Britain when wages started stagnating was after the financial crisis and before the Cameron just as the Cameron government got into power in 2009, there's been wage stagnation. So employers have captured, capital has captured all of the gains of growth. But freedom of contract is even worse, because in its 19th century conception, it's very clear that, well, workers are separated from the products of their labor, even the benefits of science that they invent, but also many people don't even have a job from which they can get wages. If private property, or if property is held privately, if most production, most jobs are the property of an employer, then many people will simply not get jobs. As Thomas More wrote in 1516 in a book called Utopia, there is a reserve army of the unemployed. This has a tendency to raise employers' bargaining power and lower wages. And employers as a group benefit from keeping unemployment intact. It's useful to have 4, 5, 6, 10% unemployment, because this disciplines workers in the workplace. Koletsky explained this in an article in 1944. Now, of course, you might say, well, okay, unions can be organized by workers. You can take collective action. And it's true that, in today's laws, in the International Labour Organization Conventions 87 and 98, there's a fundamental right to organize, to collectively bargain. But even if that's true, rights to organize for workers are much, much more limited than rights for companies to organize and merge into ever bigger entities which have much greater market power. And of course, the law can constrain, it can be very unequal between labor and capital. For instance, just one example is the Trade Union Labor Relations Act, Section 224. It says that you can't take action in solidarity with other workers at a different company that's not your employer in order to get fair wages across a sector. And employers have an incentive to divide people, to divide workers against them, raise the costs of them taking collective action and organizing in unions. So what do employers do? Well, they can foster prejudice amongst people. They can attempt to divide people taking action in solidarity with one another, because they say, well, men are different to women, black workers and white workers don't have the same interests, people who are gay and people who are straight shouldn't identify with one another. And even if this discrimination is outlawed in the workplace, which it, of course it is in most countries, they can do the same things in the media and in politics. And the more that this is done, the more that people feel that they are divided, the less likely they are to take collective action and act in solidarity with one another in the workplace or in politics. Now, workers may save money from their wages and save in companies, but that ultimately leaves them with little power. If workers put money into a pension fund, it doesn't mean that they, as small capitalists, get much influence in the way that companies run, because money going into a pension fund is then often delegated to asset managers who control shareholder rights in companies, and we're going to talk about that more. They charge percentage fees, so big asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard are in control of most workers' capital and how it's voted, and they often vote against the very things that workers would be interested in, namely higher pensions, higher wages, recognizing an independent trade union at work. And in fact, workers' savings are often used against them, incorporating their exploitation. So the third big problematic institution of capitalism is the corporation. And this notion has been, that Friedman would support that we have something called competitive capitalism, that corporations are part of a competitive capitalist system. Corporations, of course, are the face of 21st century capitalism. We think of the big brand names like Google and Tesco and BP, you know, they're the visible face of what modern globalized capitalism is. But it's very, very different to the ideas of free competition that somebody like Adam Smith would have originally written about in The Wealth of Nations. So Smith idealized a world of small partnerships, the butcher, the baker, the brewer, and he said famously that in this kind of world, as if led by an invisible hand, these groups of people, paradoxically, would lead to a distribution of wealth, as if the earth had been divided into equal proportions. So that's how Smith envisaged markets working if you had small competitive partnerships like the butcher, the baker, the brewer. Smith thought very, very differently about joint stock corporations like the South Sea Company, the Royal Africa Company, the East India Company. He saw them very clearly for what they were, which was enormous, vicious colonial entities that pillaged and exploited everywhere that they can to make as much money, as much they could in monopoly profits. And Smith vehemently attacked corporations and the directors that ran them. He said that the directors in charge of other people's money in companies were prone to negligence and profusion. He saw corporations as the very opposite of free competition. Corporations were much more like a legalized cartel. So corporations today are not really the same thing as competition at all. And when we look at the way corporate governance works, well, there are a great deal of problems that show you, I mean, just have to look at them to see what might be going wrong. I mean, first of all, if you're a director today of a company, the law, the model articles of all public companies, private companies, will say that you have the authority to manage the company, okay, but included in that authority is the right to pay yourself whatever remuneration you want. Paragraph 23 of the model articles of companies says that directors shall be entitled to such remuneration as, guess who? The directors determine. I mean, that's pretty good. It would be great if we could all set our own salaries and wages, but most of us can't, yet directors can. You have a requirement usually for a nominations committee on a board. You have a requirement for a remuneration committee. The majority of directors on a board should be independent. But together as a group, the board of directors will select the committee which pays them, which appoints them, and this group has been described by Lord Denning, amongst others, as a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Independent directors, of course, are only notionally independent because they're selected by the board, therefore they are the most dependent group on the board of directors for their jobs. And companies, well, being run by directors are often driven mostly by what shareholders want. And that's primarily because shareholders in a country like the UK, the US, hold all of the votes, or most of the votes, for companies. Shareholders own most of the votes, and most of the shareholders are large asset managers. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Legal & General, Schroders, and they have a very, very strong incentive to boost share prices, to boost short-term profits, because they charge percentage fees on assets under management. Okay, so when we look at the results of the way that companies work, we can see a pretty clear relationship between changes in the rules and what happens to something like executive pay. So this is a chart from America. We could tell the same story about Britain, but in America it's more dramatic. In 1969, you can see there on the red line, that shows the ratio between CEO pay and the average employee. In 1979, Delaware law, that's where most of the companies in America incorporate, says that directors can set their own pay. And lo and behold, it's the time at which American CEO pay starts soaring. Interestingly, back there, the salary stabilization unit, which coincides with CEO pay falling dramatically, is where the government taxes high pay very, very highly. And this correlates with the blue line, which shows the percentage of income taken by the top 1%. What we can see is over the 20th century, particularly from the New Deal in America, is inequality declined, but then from the 1970s onwards, inequality starts rising rapidly, and executive pay going up is a part of that same story. But corporations have many more problems than this. Corporations are mostly incorporated with limited liability for the shareholders and the directors. And that often means that companies have an incentive to externalize the costs of production onto other people. Courts often fail, and dramatically so, to hold companies to account for the harm that they cause. If we just take the very, very big example, one example of climate change, no court yet has held a company responsible for damage to the climate, fossil fuel companies that have caused all the pollution. We're now getting a few cases that are coming close, like a decision called Smith and Fonterra in New Zealand. There's another one called RWE and Liua in Germany, both of which say potentially you could be liable if you're a fossil fuel company for damage resulting from climate change, and you've significantly contributed to the damage. RWE is a big German coal company. In Smith and Fonterra, you have subsidiaries of companies like Exxon. But no court yet has held companies for the damage that is caused. If we look at the way that corporate insolvency works and bankruptcy, property, this is one of the last vestiges of property law. It gives people priority of property over contract, so that if you're a bank who takes security over a company's assets, then you get your loan back. If you've just got an obligation, you're a worker who's owed wages, the company goes bankrupt, you probably can't get your money back until the banks have been paid first. But on the other hand, the bank itself doesn't give any protection, any security for its own customers. If you deposit your money in a bank, you lose your property, you've just got a debt claim in contract. So if the bank folds, then the government is the party that has to guarantee. Competition, in this ideal of competitive capitalism that Friedman likes, creates winners and it creates losers. And losers go insolvent. This is an enormous amount of waste. Most small businesses will fail in the first few years. So businesses have a very strong incentive to avoid the consequences of insolvency and merge as much as possible to avoid competition. Antitrust enforcement is often very weak and too weak to prevent many monopolies forming. And if we just look at the big tech world, this is what we see, giant monopolies everywhere in our lives. The way that corporations work often leads to mass speculation. We have repeated economic crises, going from the South Sea bubble to the Wall Street crash to the global financial crisis a decade or two ago. And worse than this, what companies do if they can't game the rules, or they can't get the rules that they want through I should say free and open debate, what companies will do is that they will try to bankroll politics in order to get their preferred laws. So to protect their privilege, companies will, if they are allowed to, spend enormous amounts of money on political campaigns. And that's precisely what's been allowed in America since a decision called Buckley and Vallejo in 1976. You can spend an unlimited amount of money on an election campaign if you're a person, and the Supreme Court extended this to legal persons as well in another case called Bellotti, and more recently, Citizens United. Justice Brandeis, a famous labor advocate, described the corporation as a Frankenstein monster. And so this is the depiction that you might think from Justice Brandeis, such as the Frankenstein monster which governments have created by their corporation laws. We can imagine the institution of contract as the lifeblood of capitalism, according to Hugh Collins over at the LSE. Private property in the means of production is like capitalism's crooked backbone, and corporate competition is the artificial Frankenstein body over the bones and the blood. Altogether, this is what we can see as the institutions of capitalism. I think there's another, I'm not sure why that's come out a little bit funny. There's an even deeper problem, which Albert Einstein pointed to, which is that in a capitalist society, the ethos of people changes. Unlimited competition, says Einstein, leads to a huge waste of labor, and to that, the crippling of social consciousness of individuals. This crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. He writes in Why Socialism in 1949. Okay, so if that's the worst evil of capitalism, now let's start talking about positive objectives. Social justice, contrary to this crippling of individuals and the evils of capitalism, is the goal of democratic socialists. Justice is a multifaceted concept. We can have different meanings of justice. Basically, it means that people should get what they are due. But one of the first meanings of justice can be corrective, that wrong should be undone. If you suffered a minus, you should get a plus. Then there's the concept of distributive justice, of fairness in distribution. But a larger concept of social justice is the one that I'm going to use as the starting point for what society should be achieving. Einstein's favorite philosopher, Baruch Spinoza, happened to talk about this very meaning, which I think has become at the heart of what social justice is. Spinoza argued on the improvement of understanding that the one true good that we should pursue in life, many people pursue fame and pleasure and happiness, but all of these things are relative. Too much might be bad for you. The one true good, argued Spinoza, is to pursue a better content of one's character and lend a helping hand. And this became the heart of progressive philosophy. If we look at Wilhelm von Humboldt, he argues in 1854 that the duty of government is human development in its richest diversity. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the Fabian socialists who wrote the first Labour Party constitution, Sidney Webb was a law student at King's, went and founded the London School of Economics. They argued that the goal of society was the utmost development of faculty in the individual human being. The International Labour Organization says that peace could only be established if it's based upon social justice. And this social justice, I think, is what the Webbs and Humboldt were referring to, the idea of a creative justice where, expressed in the Universal Declaration, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of the personality is possible. So social justice is not just correcting or redistributing what is already there, but it is empowering people, expanding human potential. And the goal of a good society is to ensure that everybody can develop their potential to the full. That is what a just society does. That is social justice. Very different to one of the goals that we often see governments pursuing, which is growth in GDP. GDP is measured by company accounts, adding up all of the elements of production that companies make, and often looking at all the different market transactions, aggregating it, even if you've got pollution as a result from which companies profit, even if you're selling drugs which lower people's life expectancy. All these things can count as raising GDP. Social justice, on the other hand, has to be based on what is necessary to empower human beings and human development in its richest diversity. Okay, so that's the goal. And then third point I want to make before we look at the core features of democratic socialism is just what these words mean. So democracy, very simply, I think we can express as power in the hands of the many, not the few. This was the meaning given by Thucydides in his recounting of Pericles' funeral oration. We can add to that, that democracy is more than one person, one vote. It's the idea that everybody has equal value. Lady Hale says famously in a case called Animal Defenders. And socialism, I think, as we've already seen, is social rather than private ownership of the means of production, which can include public ownership, but it also includes common ownership, worker cooperatives, socialized capital, so long as it's organized democratically. And of course, many people will say that there's much, much more to that than socialism, much more to socialism than that. It includes values of equality, solidarity, and justice, and there are many ways in which those values can be realized. Yet the important thing is the end that's being pursued. As Einstein said, socialism is directed towards a social or ethical end, and Lord Wedderburn, a famous labor lawyer, argued that what we need is hard legal analysis allied to an alternative social vision. So it's not true, as Friedman described, that in a socialist society, all jobs are under direct control of political authorities because worker cooperatives, capital funds, which are democratically controlled, don't need any political direction. And it's also the case that you don't have to call yourself, and most political parties might not see themselves as democratic socialist parties in order to be pursuing democratic socialist goals. Social democratic party could be called social democratic rather than democratic socialist. They could be called Labour, Liberal, Conservative, Green. William Harcourt, an international lawyer in 1880, and the Chancellor, said that we're all socialists now because of the policies that we're developing. And as we're going to see around the world, democratic socialist policies have become the norm. Okay, so now we get to the positive case and where the core features of democratic socialism are going in the 21st century. First, in public and common ownership. Second, economic democracy. Third, fair taxes. And then I'm just going to say a little bit about other areas of law. Okay, so the first thing that democratic socialism has pursued and continues to pursue is bringing more of productive property into public ownership, responding to the many failures in property, contract, and corporations. You replace the price system with services that are funded free at the point of use through tax. And public ownership is most common where competition doesn't work, usually because there's a natural monopoly, or there's a network monopoly, or what John Stuart Mill would have called a natural monopoly, but the skill-based monopoly. For instance, doctors in a health service, if left to their own devices, could charge an awful lot if they weren't brought under some public regulation or public ownership. Through the 20th century, through the 20th century, as we know, there had been a sort of pendulum swing between public ownership, particularly under a government like Attlee and many post-war governments, with more nationalization of the means of production, back to more privatization, starting with Thatcher in 1979, and the development of what was called the Washington Consensus with the Reagan and first Bush governments that favored privatization, deregulation, projected through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, including shock therapy privatization for post-Soviet Russia. Now the pendulum is swinging again from more privatization back to a state where more and more countries around the world are taking basic services back into public ownership. There's an enormous wave of what is being called remunicipalization, energy, water, transport all around the world, and in the UK. not just under the most recent Labour government from 2024, but also starting with some small steps under the last Conservative governments, but mainly today with Labour taking train operating companies back into public ownership, setting up a public Great British Energy, and the steel industry. Of course, it could go a great deal further. And these things are overwhelmingly popular, and democratic socialists know this. So if we just look at the opinion polls on the popularity of public ownership, for all of these sectors, starting with the NHS, then it goes down to schools, water, rail, Royal Mail, energy companies, bus companies, the BBC, universities, all of these things see the vast majority of the British public favouring public ownership. And we see the same thing in the United States. And by the way, it's growing. So what this chart is showing is the difference between, I think it was YouGov polls in 2019, shifting up to 2024. So support for public ownership, broadly speaking, is growing. And you find the same thing in the United States. 68% support a public option healthcare provider. 63% support tuition-free university, 84% want government to invest in water, 68% want publicly owned energy, 81% want government to invest in rail, and 72% of New Yorkers want free public buses. But it's not just in the UK and the US where privatization has been, experiments in privatization have been most extreme, but actually all across wealthy democracies, we see more public ownership and more public support for public ownership. So what this chart shows is a list of countries in the OECD ranked according to the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. So you're higher up the list if you've got more human development and you're more equals. At the top is Iceland, Denmark, Norway, and going down as many as I could fit, down to Latvia, there's the United States, sort of 2/3 of the way down, there's the UK just above the middle. And if you've got a green square, for these sectors across the top, water, electricity, rail, media, banks, mail, and internet, if you've got a green square, this sector is majority publicly owned. If it's a red square, no public ownership or privatized. If it's yellow or orange, it is a sector with some government stake. And so what we can see is that the majority of wealthy democracies have most of these sectors in public ownership. And even for the internet, where the picture is much more mixed, actually a majority of OECD countries have some public sector stake in the broadband internet infrastructure. And the deviations from this pattern are essentially random. And that just shows you how resilient this idea, the democratic socialist idea of more public ownership of the means of production is. So what changes in the law when we take things into public ownership? Well, I think that there's sort of 5 main changes. First, public enterprise will not lose money to shareholders. It can reinvest revenues, so there's not money being taken away from the system. Secondly, in law, duties will often be owed to the public. So if you look at the Water Act of 1973, it said that the regional water authorities, believe it or not, had a duty to provide clean water. When the water industry was privatized, the Water Industry Act says nothing more about clean water. It says that the regulator, Ofwat, has a duty to secure reasonable returns on capital for shareholders. So the duties in law usually change. Government has the ability to directly realize targets for quality of the service rather than relying on ex post legal action. So if a sector is privatized, then you might have quality standards like clean water. But to enforce the quality standards, you need a regulator and you need legal cases to enforce the quality standards. And often that just doesn't do the job. So, you know, in a notable case in 2012, the European Commission sued the United Kingdom for all the sewage that Thames Water was putting out. And spoiler alert, Thames Water is still pouring out sewage into the rivers. Not much changes. But if a sector is in public ownership, then government can take direct action rather than relying on legal action. A fourth thing that changes is that the public service can be made free, or charges can be set according to law rather than markets. So a good example of that is the National Health Service Act, Section 1. Could pick many examples, but this is just most salient. Says that the NHS has to be free at the point of use unless there's a power for exceptional charging. And that means that the funding of the service moves from the price system to funding through principles of taxation. And there are principles of taxation, as we're going to talk about in a second, notably that tax should be progressive. There are very few principles of the price system. Usually prices are regressive, the poorest pay more, whereas taxes can be progressive where people who have the means to pay more. Beyond public ownership, democratic socialists also want to expand common ownership of the means of production, and primarily that's worker cooperatives, workers' pensions or capital funds where workers' savings go into big funds. At one point in 1950s or 60s, a management theorist called Drucker, sorry, I think the date's inaccurate, I think it might be 1976. Drucker wrote about pension fund socialism, that if the trend continued in savings and worker capital, then workers' capital would be the majority of the stock market. But as we're about to see, it didn't work out like that. Okay, so economic democracy is the next main thing that democratic socialists pursue. And that means three main things. It means rights at work, to vote for who's on the board of directors. And this is one of the crowning achievements of sector-wide collective bargaining by unions. The right to vote at work means that you can choose or participate in choosing who your boss is, alongside shareholders, if there are shareholders, in the organization. The second thing that economic democracy includes is democracy in capital. So savers in a fund, investors in a fund, have the right to determine who is on the board of their pension fund, and also control what happens with that money. So that if the money is delegated to an asset manager, that they control the voting policies that guide the shareholder voting rights if that money is invested in shares and the shares are voted. The third thing that economic democracy has come to mean is a voice for service users in industry. So this is particularly important when you're putting something into the public sector or if markets fail. If you're a consumer and the markets work, then you can vote with your feet. If you don't like one brand of bottled water, you can go to another brand of bottled water. And competition should send a signal to the water company that is losing market share to change what they do to suit consumer demand, if competition is functioning. But where competition doesn't function and consumers can't vote with their feet effectively, then what more and more countries have been doing is giving service users direct rights to vote in the way that their organization in the way that the enterprises run. And so we see that in universities, healthcare, energy companies, water. I'll give you some concrete examples in a second. So this is the idea of multi-stakeholder governance, as Simon Deacon has called it, rather than shareholders monopolizing governance. Economic democracy has a very long history. Don't have time to go into it, but it starts in the 19th century, notably in the UK, with university academics in Oxford and Cambridge revolting against the administration that they describe as having been reduced to a narrow oligarchy shortly after the 1848 revolutions. And they win an act of parliament that says that the staff should elect a majority of those on the council of the university. There's many more examples, but another really big step is in post-war Germany. The military infrastructure, the big businesses that have supported the war have collapsed and their reputation is gone. Trade unions are have a relatively strong position of moral authority and power, and they make a collective agreement, the unions and businesses, to share economic power right throughout the economy. So this is sort of like a mass collective agreement that gets written into the Weimar Constitution, that workers should participate at every level of economic organization, written by a man called Hugo Sinsheimer. Hitler abolishes workers on boards as it was instituted in the 20s, of course, and he also abolishes trade unions. But then after the Second World War, unions demand workers on boards again through collective agreements, and these things are eventually codified into the law. So there's this slow growth of towards more and more worker democracy through institutions like these, or through changes in the law like this. And then you've got a similar kind of pattern in capital. So democracy in capital first comes from collective agreements between unions and employers, where unions say, well, if our money is going into a saving fund, we want to co-manage that saving fund. In America, they were so successful, unions managed to control all of their pension funds, that Congress, in the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, clamped down on union control and said that unions could have a maximum of 1/2 of the board of a co-determined pension fund, rather than controlling all of their own money. In the UK, it's gone the other way. So there's been collective bargaining, slowly building up for union seats on pension funds, and what the law has done is set a minimum standard of 1/3 that a union or employee representatives have to have in the management of a pension. Notably, there's an exception for the university's superannuation scheme. That's another story. Okay, so public services also have a slow growth towards more service user voice. And again, if we look around the world, these types of institutions have become a majority practice. So what this map shows in green is countries where you've got a law that requires at least 1/3 of a board of directors in a large company to be elected by workers. And in the other countries where it's sort of dark blue, you have more minimal laws, worker directors in public services, not private companies, public companies, not private companies. But also in countries that are in light blue, like Italy. Italy has just passed a voluntary law for workers to be on boards. The unions definitely want more. Spain is consulting for workers for a law for worker co-determination. And Britain had a prime minister called Theresa May who proposed this in 2016. We got a voluntary version of the law in the UK Corporate Governance Code not far after, long after. But the trade unions, the TUC most notably, want to have more worker representation. The ideas are spreading. And it's also, there's a very strong push from the left wing of politics in America, notably Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, also Tammy Baldwin, Cory Booker, to have more worker democracy in the US as well. Okay, so economic democracy is spreading. Democracy in capital would have spread a lot further if there hadn't been pretty big changes to the way that the law had worked under Reagan and Thatcher. What this chart shows is actually the green line that matters most. It shows shareholding in America by the types of shareholders. So the blue line is individually held shares, going down as there's more institutional ownership of shares. So capital is becoming more and more collectivized. That's the result of the blue line going down. The green line going up shows really big defined benefit collective pension plans. And so what Drucker was arguing was that eventually, if you kept on putting that green line up, workers' capital in collective pension funds would be a majority of the stock market before too long. Drucker predicted it by 1985. If there had been no legal change, it probably wouldn't have been that fast. But what happened under Reagan is that more and more people were encouraged to have individual savings accounts, 401ks, which don't have the same ability for collective organization, for workers to collectively control their capital. And that's really the orange line that you can see rising up at the end there. And the result of that is that if you've got lots and lots of people with individual savings accounts, then they've got very little bargaining power. And so when money goes to an asset manager like BlackRock, they can, through the standard terms of the contract, take all of the votes. You see a pretty similar story in the UK. I won't go into it too much, but again, the green line, if we'd continued on the trend that had been there before Thatcher, then we would have got to 50% before too long, even considering the effects of globalization. And the main thing that happened was that workers' wages were reduced, union power was diminished, and there were tax incentives to shift to individual savings accounts. And I think it's really important to see that when workers organize their capital, they have very, very different preferences to asset managers. So one of the biggest organizations of worker representatives of pension trusts, the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees, came up with a policy called red line voting that said we want standards for instance, pay ratios between the board and average workers. We want targets, for instance, on gender diversity and racial diversity on boards of directors. We want an environmental committee on every board to drive towards clean energy. All of the things that are being called woke capitalism and which big asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard are now distancing themselves from. And then the third thing, the third sort of feature of economic democracy is voice in public services. I think it's really important to see how at first this doesn't go very far in Britain and many other countries, because there's this conception that if you nationalize an industry, job done. You've got the thing in public ownership, that's going to stop all the problems of private ownership of the means of production. And there was a man called Herbert Morrison, grandfather of somebody called Peter Mandelson, who you might remember, who was London County Council leader, and he argued that if you have a nationalised industry, then the people on the board should be experts. We can consult with the unions, we might consult with consumer groups, but they shouldn't have any vote and they shouldn't have any voice. And that was the pattern of post-war nationalised industry. And it was something that made nationalised industry very easy for Thatcher to attack, because she said, well, this is just incredibly patronising. The idea that somebody else knows best, that the minister in Whitehall knows best, was an explicit argument that she used over and over again as a justification for putting what was the public sector back in the hands of people by selling it off to private shareholders. But what we can see of public services that have remained in Britain or around the world where things have been brought back into public ownership or remained in public ownership is that you have representation for service users. So in universities, students and alumni can vote in many, or have a vote in many university governing bodies. In King's, you'll have representatives from the student union that go up to the council. In the health service, staff and also residents through local councils have representation in hospital boards. In energy, the German laws, state laws, require that councils are represented in governing boards. In Eau de Paris, the Paris water service, the public is represented again through councillors. Wikipedia is an example I like very much. The service users, who are also the people who edit, anybody who has an account in Wikipedia, can vote for who's on the governing body of the world's 5th biggest website. And in fact, I saw a thing today on Wikipedia that the votes are going on right now. Or you've got German football clubs where members have the 50% plus one rule. So these are the kinds of systems that you have for economic democracy. Now, I'm a bit pressed for time, so I'm going to skip over a floor of social rights. But just to say that economic democracy goes together with minimum standards across the board. And broadly speaking, whether we look at rights at work, rights for tenants, rights to consumers, standards have been rising across all countries. This chart from Simon Deacon, the Labour Regulation Index, looks at all different indicators of labour law across 117 different countries. And we can see very clearly that the trend is going from 1970 to 2020 in the direction of more employment rights, more rights at work. And so, it's for reasons like this that when Friedman says the bulk of economic activity is organized by a free market in a free society, well, that just clearly isn't true, because markets are increasingly shaped by social rights. Okay, the third thing that democratic socialists pursue are fair taxes. And anybody who's done tax law knows that you always start the study of tax law by looking at what the principles of taxation should be. And everyone knows that one of the first principles of taxation is the progressive principle, that the rich should pay more, or as Adam Smith put it, that the rich should contribute something more than in proportion than in the proportion of completely equal payment. So it shouldn't be the case that if you're wealthy, you pay 10% and I pay 10%, even though I've got much less money. So the rich pay more than the poor, and by extension, capital pays more than labor, and we should tax unearned wealth rather than jobs. These ideas all flow fairly comfortably from the first principle of taxation. Other principles of taxation that are pretty uncontroversial is that taxes should be certain, they should be convenient to pay, and tax collection should be efficient. Democratic socialist parties wouldn't disagree with any of those things, but they would add more to this idea of fairness in taxation. First of all, there should be a principle, and I think this is what democratic socialist parties pursue everywhere, even if it's not always spoken, of what the absolute level of taxation should be. Not just the relative taxation, but relative levels of taxation. But tax should be enough to fully fund public services. There's an absolute objective. And that goes to what the share of tax in GDP should be. And thirdly, that taxes are used and should be used to correct historical inequality. As wealth and income inequality has become ever more extreme and ever more unjustified, this is one of the key reasons why many, many more people are advocating wealth taxes like they have in Norway, over which an election was just recently fought and won. Now, in the UK, as you all know, taxes have become much more regressive. This chart shows the top rate of income tax in purple, and Margaret Thatcher started cutting the top rate of income tax greatly. Corporation tax has gone down, while regressive taxes like value-added tax and national insurance have been creeping up. And that might look like a sorry picture for the case that I'm making, that democratic socialism is expanding. But if you look at it in the long view, we can see that actually the progressive principle is still broadly there compared to the sort of 19th century characterization of the economy. The top rate of income tax was going up, and that broadly mirrored the fall in inequality, which was in the blue line. And inequality has gone up as taxes have gone down. By the way, almost exactly the same inverse relationship between union membership and inequality in Britain. Thomas Piketty also gives us the same idea for taxes in many different countries. Broadly speaking, progressive tax has won. But the public supports much, much more fairness in taxes. In the UK, 75% of people support a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million. There's lots of debates about how you do a wealth tax, the complications in administration, what classes of property you include in the wealth tax, but there is no doubt that there's very high support. 82% support increasing income tax for the super rich, 59% support increasing corporation tax. In the US, it's not really different. There's not as much polling data on the same things, but for instance, 72% of Americans support a new tax on big tech, and across the EU, there's 80% support for a minimum rate of corporate tax, regardless of which country and multinational company it's in. So, this is the social democratic or democratic socialist ideal expressed by Martin Luther King. Call it democracy, call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth in this country for all God's children. Okay, so I'm going to skip over democratic socialist approach to public law, criminal law, international and trade law, but broadly my argument is that the values here are pretty much the same as international human rights standards when we step outside of the economy, except that democratic socialists will emphasize why civil and political rights are not realized based on the economic fundamentals, like the causes of crime, not being tough on the causes of crime, not just being tough on crime. But the last thing I want to get to is to knock down 4 myths of capitalism before I finish. So firstly, that capitalism leads to innovation. Joseph Schumpeter famously argues in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy that a perennial gale of creative destruction is an essential fact of capitalism, and this produces innovation. But actually, the evidence shows very clearly that innovation does not come from what Schumpeter is describing as destruction. We just have to take the iPhone as an example. Mariana Mazzucato writes in The Entrepreneurial State that all of the important innovations in the iPhone, namely the internet, touchscreens, GPS, were developed with public money by the US Department of Defense. And of course, if you think about Silicon Valley, it's located where it is because you have Californian universities very close by that receive enormous amounts of public funding. But more importantly, the evidence shows that people innovate when they have security, not when they are at risk from some kind of destructive process, when they face unemployment or insolvency. When people perform mechanical tasks, bonuses or sanctions can help them to do that, but the behavioral psychology evidence shows that people are more creative when they aren't incentivized by bonuses, when they aren't incentivized by, or they aren't sanctioned. So that's from some research by a behavioral psychologist called Dan Ariely. And people are also more innovative, the evidence suggests, if we measure patent filings, when they have greater job security at work and when there's more democracy at work. So Acharya and his co-authors look at patent filings around the world, regression analysis to see how that maps onto job security and democracy in the workplace, and find that there is a very strong correlation between more patent filings and more job security, more employment rights. So innovation is not something that comes primarily from destruction. On the contrary, when we look at the way that insolvency laws are developed and competition law is developed, what we're trying to do in modern societies is constrain the destructive elements of competition and economic failure. The second claim that's very common to hear is that capitalism is more productive. Friedrich von Hayek says this: a market's spontaneous order leads to greater productivity. Yet the evidence shows that far from Friedrich von Hayek's concept of a free market without any employment rights, any voice at work, any public ownership at all, the evidence shows that people are more productive at work when they're treated fairly, when they have fair pay, when there's equality of pay, when there's some kind of parity between what somebody working next to me and I am paid. And this comes from a behavioral study by Alan Cohn and Ernst Fair in a paper in 2014. It was summed up by Herbert Simon, this idea that there's a considerable body of evidence to support the participation hypothesis. The changes in human behavior can be brought about rapidly only if people participate in deciding how the change is done. So if you've got voice at work, you're likely to contribute more, you're likely to be more productive and also innovative. Third claim and third myth is that capitalism is less wasteful. Richard Posner argues that markets are just, that justice is efficiency, that's his main meaning, because in a world of scarce resources, waste should be regarded as immoral. Richard Posner also thinks that competition law, antitrust is dead. Monopolies like Microsoft and Google are great. He says, I don't have any problem with the prices that they charge or the quality of their products, and neither does my cat, who is an avid consumer of extremely expensive cat food, right? So we're happy. So he's happy in a world without antitrust, with lots of monopolies. But the reality, the evidence suggests that his version of capitalism with monopolies creates an extraordinary amount of waste, not just from unemployment, not just from pollution, but monopoly profits being diverted into ventures that most people will never benefit from. Think about the metaverse from Mark Zuckerberg, which had billions plowed into it. Think about the incredible amounts of money that are going into AI at the moment, one of the biggest bubbles, and we'll see where that really goes. There's an extraordinary amount of waste with capitalism as it currently works. Final claim is Milton Friedman's claim, or almost where we started. He claims that capitalism is freedom, and we can see that that's just wrong. So in capitalist societies, ultra-capitalist societies, like the end of Weimar Germany, Hitler comes to power when he's bankrolled by the circle of economic friends. They give him 1 million Deutschmarks, and the Nazi Party is the first party to work out, well, hold on, there's no limits on election spending under the Weimar Constitution. We could just get loads of money from all the industrialists and outspend every other political party. And that's precisely what they did. The Nazis in 1932 and 1933 outspent all other parties combined, and then Hitler came to power. So capitalism and democracy don't really go very well together in that example. Then there's the example of Pinochet in Chile, who Milton Friedman supported greatly. And, of course, the Pinochet government tortured and disappeared its rivals. And in the US today, since this case from the Supreme Court, Buckley and Vallejo, that allows unlimited spending in elections, corporate money floods the political process, and we can all see the descent, the abyss, the descent into the abyss of American politics, almost ceasing to function as a viable state, coming apart, its constitution coming apart before our eyes. So, we've got these myths of capitalism. The truth is that democratic socialism, the corrections of the 19th century conceptions of capitalism, is what gives us innovation, productivity, and strengthens democracy and leads to greater prosperity. So to conclude, we see a crisis of democratic socialism despite its success, in the very face of its success. We see the Labour Party, which on the back of the party card says it's a democratic socialist party. We see the Labour Party polling at about 19% at the moment. You see the SPD in Germany on about 14%. You see the United States Democrats suffering bitter defeats to Trump, but social democracy is on a back foot worldwide. And it might be worth to get out of this trying something different. In other words, what's popular and has seemed to work for a very long time, namely more public ownership of public services, economic democracy on the floor of rights, and fair taxes. As Nye Bevan said, there is only one hope for mankind, that is democratic socialism. So I've hoped to convince you at the very least that Friedman was wrong, but also that this might be the way to think about what to do in the future. Thanks very much.